In the listening section, the lectures are going to be a lot more complicated than the conversations. And so you're going to have a much better plan with your notes, and you're going to need to be a little bit more careful in general to get a really high score on these lectures. So it's really important that you be ready for the difficulty and that you have a really clear idea of how you're going to attack these items. Okay, so taking notes is important on the lectures. In fact, I would say that taking notes is really important on the lectures. It's actually probably the most important thing for you to do with the lectures. Because you're going to use the notes to answer your questions. You're going to do something very similar to what you do in the reading, and so it's important for you to practice taking notes and get good at taking notes in a very specific way. And the main thing you're going to do is you're going to have a plan for the way that you listen to these lectures and the way that you write the things down that you're listening to. The most important thing is to catch the main ideas because the questions are going to relate to the main ideas. The minor details are probably not going to be direct answers to the questions. They might contribute or they might help you to understand what the main ideas are, but in general, the questions will be asking you what are the main concepts that are given in the lectures. So again, you need to have a plan for your notes. This looks similar to the conversation in the beginning, but it's quite different. And here what we have is an example of a lecture that is about the different noises that dolphins make. Dolphins are fish that make a lot of interesting noises. So when you're listening, the number one objective that you have is to find the different sections, and they will give you really defined section in the lectures. So this is just an example. You're not listening to the real lecture because that would take too long, but the first thing that you hear is the narrator say something like, "Now listen to a lecture about animal communication." And then the professor will come on and say, "Today we're going to talk about dolphins, and dolphins have a tendency to make a lot of different sounds, and they seem to be communicating. Sometimes they are identifying themselves, blah, blah, blah." The first part is going to be an introduction. Almost always it's like a paragraph of information that is an introduction, and what that's doing is it's giving you some orientation to what's happening before they give you really complicated questions. Then you want to listen for something like this. The professors say there are 3 typical types of vocalization that dolphins make. This is an important point. They're going to indicate to you that they're about to transition into the main body sections of this lecture. And in this particular instance, they say 3 types of vocalization. That's a really easy, clear, direct message for you to think to yourself, okay, there will be 3 categories that I must listen for and try to catch. The most common number is 3 because the people that make the TOEFL are kind of crazy and they are obsessed. They are completely obsessed with the number 3. So most lectures will have 3 body paragraphs. Okay, so then the professor is going to say something like, the first type of communication that dolphins make that we're going to talk about are whistles. And it's not important that you understand exactly what whistles are. They're not going to ask you the question, what is a whistle? What they're going to ask you about is the importance of whistles or the different characteristics of whistles, because here in this case the professor is going to say something like, whistles are a high frequency noise they make that humans can't hear. It appears that each dolphin has a signature whistle so they can identify themselves. The families of dolphins have related sounding whistles so they can tell when they're in the same family. And a few other details. And that part is going to be what relates to the answer to the question. So knowing exactly what the word whistle means, not super important, but that number 1 there indicates to you what the question is going to be. Okay, then they're going to say something like, I want to talk about the next type of sound they make, which is clicks. And again, you don't need to know exactly what clicks means. Clicks is just indicating to you what the question is going to be about. So here they're going to say, all right, clicks are what dolphins use for their sonar or sound location. They can communicate and navigate. They can create 3-dimensional images of their immediate surroundings using sonar. It's very sensitive. One of the reasons dolphins swim side by side is so they don't interfere with each other's clicks. And so you have to identify that this is very different from the whistles. It's not really used for communications, it's used for navigation. And again, you don't need to know clicks, but they're going to ask you about the use of the clicks, which is going to be related to the way that they navigate in the water. Okay, the third one is called burst pulses. Again, this is something you don't know. I didn't know what burst pulses meant the first time that I saw it. It's not important. It's, again, indicating what the sort of section is, and you're going to have to catch what they say immediately after it. So, we just call the burst pulses all the other sounds that dolphins make. They use it when they're having fights, and it seems that when they are trying to find a mate, they use these burst pulses. Okay, and then in the end, they're going to give you a sort of concluding section that will have several different pieces of information. And it might work in the same way as those middle three sections, but it might not. You want to be careful to catch these pieces of information if possible, but it's not going to be as critically important. Here, you'll notice the way I organize this, and yes, this is a little bit artificial because it's not a real, they weren't notes that I was taking sort of spontaneously, but it shows you the construction of a lecture. Here we have the introduction. This is going to give you orientation, and then these three sections are going to be three questions. We can, with almost certainty, we can say that 1, 2, and 3 are going to be related to questions. Okay. And then that's more concluding information. So here's what you need to do. Sentence 1 in a paragraph relates to, in this case, what the different sounds are that a dolphin makes, right? So they say the first type that we're going to talk about is whistles, the second type are clicks, the third are burst pulses. Those are going to predict or repeat what the question will be. So you will get a question that says something about whistles, one that says something about clicks, and one that says something about burst pulses. Sentence 2, that's going to be the answer. It's almost always the piece of information that's immediately after the important section information. Almost always. So it's, with whistles, we'll just look at this as an example. They're probably going to say, what's important about whistles? And the answer will be something related to, well, they are a high frequency and humans cannot hear them. It's less probable that you'll have to say that down here at the bottom, families of dolphins have signature whistles that have similar characteristics so that they know who's in their family. It's much more probable that they'll just ask you that first piece of information after the introduction paragraph. So this is what you're really trying to do with your notes. You're trying to catch these pieces of information so you can predict the questions and answer them without having to use your memory. And here at the very bottom, this new green arrow that appeared, I'll make it go away and make it come back. This is the end of the lecture, and you want to try to do the same thing that you do for those first 3 sections, but it's not as probable that you'll get a question here. But just to be safe, I want you to try to catch this information, because one thing they like to do is ask you a question about the last thing the professor said on occasion, and that kind of sucks. Okay. So again, finding the sections is critically important. And you're going to have certain indicators that will help you to find these different sections. There's always going to be 3 body sections, an introduction, 3 body sections, and then maybe a conclusion or just something they say at the end to finish the lecture. So one thing that you hear the most often is there are 3 somethings. There are 3 types of dolphin noises. And then they're going to give you, one is this, one is that. And another way to indicate that they're going to start a new section is to use pauses or funny noises. So the professor will say, okay, so whistles is the first way that dolphins make noise. Okay, the second noise they make is clicks. So they use those pauses to indicate that they're changing sections. Anytime you hear the number 3, anywhere on the TOEFL, in fact, not only the lectures, in any place in the TOEFL, if we ever see the number 3, it's going to directly relate to a question because, as I said before, the people that make the TOEFL are crazy and they are obsessed with the number 3. So if you hear the number 3, particularly in the beginning of a lecture, they're going to clearly indicate to you what the sections are. Other thing to listen for are just pauses. Sometimes you can hear the professor stop and make noises with their papers like I'm doing right now. Another thing they might do is ask a rhetorical question. Well, what is the most common way that a dolphin communicates? The most common way that a dolphin communicates is through whistles. Sometimes this is actually really helpful if there's a student that's participating in the class. They can ask the question or they can make a comment to the professor. And if they do that, there's a very high probability that whatever the student says happens at the transition point between two sections. So a student almost always gives you helpful information or indicates that you need to pay attention to the next piece of information, because if a student asks a question, the professor will provide an answer. And what are we looking for on this test? We are looking for answers. Repetition is also really important. Many times the professor will say a word or a short phrase that you're not expected to know, and that can usually indicate the beginning of a section. For example, that last one with the dolphins was burst pulses, so the professor might say something like, okay, the final one is called burst pulses. And then maybe a student says, I'm sorry, burst pulses? And then the professor says, yeah, burst pulses. That's when a dolphin does this and that and this and that. They're repeating that piece of information because they know you probably will not know it, and it's difficult and it's important. Another one is when they give definitions. This is usually something they do in the very first section. And in this case, they didn't do it with dolphin noises because dolphin noises are very easy. But one thing that they might do is say, we understand that dolphins communicate with each other. And in this case, the definition of communication is any indication that one animal gives to another animal to convey an idea or to share information. If they give you a definition, there's a good probability that they're going to ask you what that definition was. Okay, let's talk about the question. So now you've taken all of the information in, and now you have to get ready for the questions. There are always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. The good thing is they're predictable. Question number 1 is always the main topic question. That's always the first question they ask. What is the main topic of this lecture? In this case, it's going to be the different noises that dolphins make. It's not going to be the way dolphins communicate, and it's not going to be the way dolphins navigate because that's too specific. It'll be the different noises that dolphins make. It's always going to be relatively simple, and here you probably don't need your notes because if you don't understand the main idea at this point, then you probably had a problem with that particular lecture. Okay, then the most important section of the questions is going to be questions 2, 3, and 4. These are always going to relate to those different sections. So it's going to be section 1, section 2, and section 3. And it's important to note that this is 50% of the questions that you're going to get on any lecture. They're going to be a little bit more complex, and you really need to use your notes. These questions are built in exactly the same way as the reading questions, so they punish you if you're just looking at the 4 different options and trying to think of which one looks correct, because all of them sound correct. So therefore, you want to use the same strategy that you use in the reading. First, you look for the answer in your notes. You look at the question, you ignore the options they give you, you look at your notes, you find the correct answer in your notes, and then you relate it back to the 4 options that they give you. That will make your life much, much, much easier. This step here is the most important one in the lectures. So you can ignore everything else, but you must get good at these 3 detailed questions. Okay, and then you're going to have 2 other questions. And it's important to note that sometimes these 2 other questions will will be mixed in with the detail question. So sometimes it'll be a main topic question, which is number 1, then one detail, which is number 2. Then they'll give you another question, then a detail question, then another detail question, and then another question. So sometimes that order can get mixed. And these are different types of questions. The most common type is a listen again question, which is, just like in the conversations, you hear another section of the lecture, you hear a section of the lecture repeated, and you just have to interpret what is being said. The good thing about these questions is you don't need notes. You might get an opinion or attitude question. So in this case, it would be, what is the professor's opinion about the sounds that we do not understand? Does she think that they are useful, or does she think that they are just noise? Something like that. And those you have to interpret a little bit the information. And occasionally, but this is extremely unlikely, and in fact, starting in 2014, I think these are no longer on the TOEFL. You may have something similar to the final question in the reading, where you have 3 categories. So maybe they give you, in this case, clicks, whistles, and burst pulses, and then they'll give you a characteristic, and you have to match that characteristic with the category. Those are more complicated, but I think they're very unlikely. Okay, the mechanics of questions. This is important to understand, but you're not going to be completely fixated on this during the test. You can almost always predict the detail questions based on the sections of the listening. So what I mean by that is, if you identify what that section is, you know what the question is going to relate to. So in this case, we know that we're going to have questions related to whistles, clicks, and burst pulses, because we caught those 3 pieces of information as being the main sections. The first sentence in the section is going to be a repetition of what the question is, or maybe a predictor of what the question is, and then the second sentence is going to provide you what the answer will be. So always focus on that second piece of information in the section. The later details are not usually going to be direct answers. They might contribute to an answer, or they might help you to understand it better, but it's not as common for them to be the direct answer to the question. One of the other questions is almost always a listen again question, and that's going to be easier for you because you don't need your notes and you can relax a little bit. You don't have to have understood the entire lecture, and all you have to do is pay attention to that small piece and answer the question based on that, and it's almost independent of the lecture. Okay, this is a long video, so we'll just do a very short summary. The lectures are really long compared to the conversations, so be prepared for them. You always need notes in the lectures. 100% of the time you are going to take notes and you're going to use them to answer the questions. Do not answer the questions from memory, because they will punish you and it will be a terrible experience and you'll get a bad score. You always want to use your notes to answer the questions. When you're taking notes, finding the sections is really, really, really important for you to be able to answer the questions correctly. And we know exactly what 4 of the 6 questions will be. And there are only a limited number or type of unpredictable questions. You're going to get 2 unpredictable questions, and there are not very many types. Okay, that's it for the lectures. Good luck, do some practice, and remember, working on your notes is the most important thing that you can do in this part of the TOEFL.